My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And on this episode, what is it that it is? Zut-a-law, it's Sacrebleu.
Our first segment is the Basic Crawl.
Sacrebleu is a 13-page adventure written and illustrated by Tito B.A. for 4 to 8 characters of levels 1 to 3. It's designed with Diogo Nogueira's sharp swords and sinister spells rules in mind, but is generally D&D compatible, and is a small sandbox setting on an island where a valuable and addictive fungus is to be found.
The module begins with a black and white hex map of the island of Erewhon. Note, there is also a color map available, but it's a separate PDF. We begin with an introduction where we learn about some of the common monsters on Erewhon. We get some notes about traveling in Erewhon, and then we are given a block of information about the World War I era French army weapons that the goblins use. The next section of the module is Wilderness Encounters. After that, we begin the town of Fairmead. The town of Fairmead was recently attacked by goblins, and the mayor wizard was apparently killed, and so we have something of an unstable, uncertain situation in the town. This section includes shops, ships that may be in port, and what each of those ships buy and sell. We also have a Fairmead map, and a section on adventuring around Fairmead. Next up in the module is the Ambush on the Old Road. This is a detailed encounter that introduces the French-speaking goblins firsthand. Next, we have the Goblin Burrow, which is our principal dungeon here, and it features 8 keyed locations. The Goblin Burrow is actually a temple to an ancient time deity, worshipped by the cockroach people that used to live in Rich Man's Swamp. More about later. There is a time portal here that the goblins have opened, dragging a platoon of French World War I soldiers through time and space to Erewhon. And, quote, after eating the brains of these prisoners, the goblins learned how to use their weapons and some French words and mannerisms. Next comes Rich Man's Swamp, which is the home of the precious mycolol fungus. And then we conclude with the Hill Temple, which is the hiding place of a not-really-dead wizard who is plotting revenge. This is a micro-dungeon that has 3 keyed locations. So let's talk about how we have used this in our games. Tom?
Well, I ran it as an online play-by-post, which lasted about 3 months before real life took over and I had to put it on indefinite hiatus. That was using the Into the Odd rule set.
I have only read it, although when I was preparing for this episode, I thought I played it at a convention, but that can't be possible because the convention was way before this was published, but it definitely involved goblins, possibly orcs, using modern-day weapons, so I don't know. But for purposes of this, we'll just assume I've only read it. Let's talk about things we liked about Sacrebleu. Tom, kick us off here.
Well, let's start off with just the recurring carpet of background detail that's in all the encounter tables, especially in the wilderness, which is that Tito B.A., the author, has chosen to use the flora and fauna of his native Brazil throughout, which is I just found really, really interesting. I had to kind of, highlight a lot of names of birds and trees and then right-click and search for what they actually were before I could describe them to the players. But and it's really good for that reason as well. It's the kind of book you couldn't have made a long time ago before Google existed, because you'd waste page after page talking about animals. But in this case, you just kind of use it liberally in your encounter tables, and you've got an entirely different landscape to explore from the typical Western European one that we know and love.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I highlighted as well as things that I liked about this module. I think that the inclusion of the Brazilian flora and fauna, it really elevates the module in a certain way. Like you said, it kind of breaks away from the typical Western assumptions about what this land looks like. If you're not from that part of the world, it does kind of force you to look some things up and learn a few things about flora and fauna from the region. And I think it just adds an interesting texture to the whole thing. I mean, we can see it in other parts of the module as well. Like, for example, in Fairmead, we occasionally get entries for for taverns and shops and things that talk about some of the things they sell. And those things they sell frequently like incorporate some of this sort of, I don't know, it feels like a very like sort of Brazilian approach to things, I suppose. Like it doesn't feel super Western, right? Like one of the taverns sells this clam chowder, for example, but it's noted that it's served with fried plantains, which I thought was great. And then later on in the module, we have like this recipe, a whole recipe to make this particular salve that uses like some of the flora that's called out earlier in the module. And so I think the whole module overall just has like a lot of interesting texture in that way. And I liked it a lot too. I thought it was great. What else did you like about it?
Well, I also like the way it's a manageable sized island for traveling around, seeing new and interesting things, and possibly fighting them. But each of the regions, which are kind of detailed locations that we mentioned just now in the basic crawl, each of those feels quite distinct in the landscape around it as well. So Fairmead is surrounded by rolling fields, and then you get up towards the swamp, and of course that's just swampy and terrifying and has giant cockroaches in it. But they all, I think especially because they have that same, roughly the same wilderness random table joining them together, they do kind of feel like they are different regions of a single place, rather than just like a patchwork of different ecosystems that have been put together so that one area is the tropical paradise zone and the next bit's the Arctic zone. It's not like that. It's sort of mountains and hills and fields and swamps that all seem to flow into each other pretty nicely. Actually, I've got to say, apart from the zombies and goblins and whatnot, Erewhon seems like quite a nice place to visit. I think that's why I enjoyed it so much.
Yeah. One of the things that I really liked about the module is somewhat related to that, which is the town of Fairmead itself. This is, in my opinion, a wisp of an adventure. I mean, it's pretty, the core adventure is fairly straightforward and pretty short, probably good for 2, maybe 3 sessions, I'm thinking. And yet, the town of Fairmead, I wouldn't say that the detail is... It's not detailed in the sense of like, okay, here is a shop and all the different things they sell and all the prices and all the NPCs. It's not detailed like that. It's more... It's a lighter touch throughout the town. Like you get like little glimpses of all the different types of shops and people and goings on in the town. And it's just enough to grab onto. Like I thought you can kind of do the core adventure of the module, but then you can kind of go back to Fairmead, right? And you can have like adventures that spin out from Fairmead. There's a really great encounter table for Fairmead, and each of those little encounters like is just a few sentences in description, but absolutely packed with potential, right? So for example, on this table, one of the entries is a small fountain on the wall of a mansion is bubbling with fresh water. The liquid is poisoned by a vengeful spirit. That's a great little side quest, right? A great little side adventure. Sometimes I find that if the town is really interesting and there's a lot of like texture and a lot of like cool stuff in the town, and I think Fairmead is such a town, the players will want to wander about and just get into trouble sometimes. And so it's nice to have these little like plot hooks that are kind of buried in there. I'm also reminded of, I think the reason why Fairmead appeals to me so much is because I'm reminded of my absolute favorite thing in all of tabletop role-playing games, which is the first time we learn about Skullport in Dragon Magazine number 172. It's my favorite thing in the world, in tabletop role-playing games at least. And I like that for all the same reasons. Like, it's this kind of like ramshackle community. It has the feeling of like a sort of port of call, right? Which is great, which I love. I guess I love like kind of naval things, right? And just so many like interesting characters, a sort of melange of peoples and cultures. And I just think it's really cool. So yeah, I loved Fairmead, and I would love to see I would like to see a version of this where Fairmead is expanded, or at least like just a little setting of Fairmead, because I just thought it was a pretty cool little town.
Yeah, I was a little disappointed that my game did not linger in Fairmead as long as I was hoping it would. It was sort of, okay, buy some stuff, hit the road, go looking for goblins. Okay, right, whatever. Yeah. But yeah, actually, your description there of what's so good about Fairmead and the idea that it's what you come back to, because I noted a couple of things here that I like, which I'll elucidate shortly, and I hadn't really figured out why or how they would both work together, but that actually makes sense. When you first arrive, one of the things I like is that many things are set up to be just on the cusp of some change. So you arrive in Fairmead just after it's been attacked by the goblins. Lots of people have been killed. The mayor has definitely been killed, and that wasn't his twin brother. But the goblins have run away for some reason, which you can find out later. So that's going on, and then in the absence of the mayor, this dwarf mercenary has taken over, and he's not sure what he's going to do next. Meanwhile, over in the Time Temple, something catastrophic is going to happen there. But of course, all those things are, as you note, they're going to resolve fairly quickly. I would say, I think in about 2 to 3 sessions.
It felt like about 2 sessions to me, yeah.
Yeah. But then, that's it. You've got all these trade details going on. And as you say, they're not detailed. There's not a price list for anti-mosquito balm or whatever. But what you do have is that there's, for example, the captain of a ship who wants to buy poison arrow frogs. And out in the wilderness, you can come across a frog trader who sometimes has those frogs to sell. And so it's going around finding out what certain people sell, what certain people buy, which gives you that sort of motivation to keep being involved in the faction politics of this island, maybe try and take it over yourself, And I was quite lucky choosing Into the Odd to run this, because Into the Odd already has a system of detachments and enterprises. So it makes it a particularly good fit for this, because I knew when I was saying, you'll get this many gold coins for doing this job at the sort of intro-level PC Adventurers thing, right after their equipment list where they're deciding what to buy with those handful of gold coins, there's also, on the next page of Into the Odd, is a price list for setting up your own business, maybe harvesting fungus and selling it to guys on ships. Yeah. So, I think that's it. It's you go out, you find out about the goblins, something happens that's terrible, and, adventures happen. But then you can decide what to do next. And the fate of the town, I think, could well be in your hands if you want to keep hanging around on the island.
Yeah. I think that there's just a lot of promise here. I personally could take some of the details that are in the town and in the module overall and spin them out to create a whole campaign setting, or at least pretty close to a campaign setting, at least a lot of sessions. But I think it would be great to see more. I hope the author continues to do something with this setting. I think it's a pretty good one.
I think he might well, because the version we've got now is version 2. Originally it was mostly about the wilderness, and then all the Fairmead stuff was added in an update to the PDF. So that's great. It got bigger that way. And there are lots of hooks. There's lots of little threads of things, there's sort of a mystery of this missing shopkeeper called Tonyo, who you can find little clues to around the place, like a side quest in a video game almost. Like you're doing something else and you keep finding little artifacts that relate to this guy. And there's quite a few little bits like that. And some things you don't even really notice on a read-through. When I was running it, I didn't really notice the fact there's a black dragon living in the swamp, like a young black dragon. But then he showed up as the first random encounter, and I suddenly realised, there's backstory here, and the player character decided to become his friend and promised to kill all the goblins for him and all that stuff.
Yeah, because it hates goblins.
It hates goblins, Don't know why.
It's very anti-goblin black dragon.
I think it might say why, but I forgot. Yeah, but that's interesting. You
might say the goblins of this island have a particular fear
of a black
dragon. Yeah. So let's move on. So what else did you like about this?
I think we've probably covered most of the things. Oh, actually, I was iffy on the Time Temple, because I don't know, I'm not a huge fan of that kind of thing necessarily, but on balance, I think it does work. This idea of a time portal that can bring people and things through from other times and places, and the next one in line is going to be opening a gate to this ancient time deity. The next one that happens when the PCs arrive. And the reason I sort of came around to it is because I realised that you can actually do a lot of different things with this. It could be relatively straight up vanilla fantasy, if you want to call it that, because if you think of 3 Hearts and 3 Lions, or is it 3 Lions and 3 Hearts? Anyway, that book from Appendix N in D&D, that's about time travelling to a fantasy land. Or you can go kind of dial it completely all the way up to what I think is the inspiration for this, which is Mary Gentle's Grunts, which is about a bunch of orcs who kind of steal a dragon's treasure, but the dragon's treasure is Vietnam War era US Army gear, and they start acting like stereotypical American soldiers from movies. And it's pretty useful, and it doesn't necessarily have to be just dropping incongruous elements into a fantasy setting. So I think it works out pretty well, and it gives you more excuse to learn about the older history of the setting as well.
I like some of those elements too. I've got like two more points to make here on things that I enjoyed. One of them was that I did quite like the existence, or I should say the remainders of the cockroach people that used to inhabit this world, right, or inhabit this land. I like themes like that in my fantasy gaming, like ancient peoples that are unusual or bizarre, and we kind of have all of their leftover magical shit that we're like coping with or dealing with, you know. Yeah. I've noticed that this is a really this is a big time recurring theme in a lot of these OSR modules. I don't know if this has like always been a thing. Maybe I'm just misremembering. I don't know, but it feels like fully half the things we cover on this show have some element like this, right? I mean, just off the top of my head, Dead Planet, Carcosa, Fever Swamp all had like elements like this, right? Where there's this ancient people and they're gone, and now we're kind of like, you know, coping with the leftovers.
Yeah, doesn't Operation Unfathomable also have like actual cockroach people as well? Yeah,
many of them do. Yeah, like Carcosa had the snake people. Dead Planet had those sort of like strange insectoid like death fetishists, and then Fever Swamp had the oh gosh, what was in Fever Swamp? There was some kind of ancient people.
Yeah, there's a thesis in this anyway. That's
yeah. I just think I think it's an interesting theme, and I don't know if it's like intentional, but I like that they're cockroach people because of that sort of that old saying that like cockroaches will always be here or whatever, you know, like at the end of all things there will be cockroaches and share or whatever. Right?
Yeah, I think that's why it is. Also, I think there's a Lovecraft connection. Like, isn't the great race of Yith? Don't they turn into cockroach people?
I think that's right. Yeah. One last note, somewhat related. I ended up being very fond of the whole goblin storyline. In fact, the module doesn't tell you until you get to that part of the dungeon, like what's going on with the goblins. We're just told about their very specific, detailed World War I era
quite
weapons.
Detailed, isn't it? Yeah,
it is. Yeah, and the fact that they speak French, and you see that, and already, because the module is called Sacrebleu with a big exclamation point, you're kind of like already primed for this to be kind of like a jokey thing, you know? And but I ended up really liking it. Like, there's something kind of fundamentally amusing about goblins that speak French and have all these weapons, and like and while PTSD is not an amusing subject, there's something kind of like, there's a sort of gallows humor in the fact that the goblins all have like PTSD.
From a war right? They weren't personally in. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And like, and so, but I liked the basic sort of through line of that, like when the characters first encounter them, and maybe we'll talk about this during the questions section. But like, I think it's really interesting that like you first encounter them, presumably the player characters don't understand what these weapons are. It must seem very, very like wild and unusual and like scary, right? And then it kind of like, you know, it keeps going, and you start to like learn, as players at least, like what's going on. But I imagine the player characters still don't really understand, right? Like they don't have any basis for understanding what's going on, right? Like they don't know what the fuck World War I is, right? And so I ended up really liking it. As a reader of the module, I really kind of enjoyed that kind of slightly tongue-in-cheek storyline. I thought it was pretty good. Let's talk about questions we had. So, when you ran this, and I understand you did it as a play-by-post, so it may not be quite the same as if you ran it in person, but I'm curious, like, did this come off as an absurd or gonzo adventure?
I think it does a bit. The way it's pitched, even before you get to francophone goblins, it's quite high fantasy. You know, the wizard Algieba escapes on a flying carpet in the backstory immediately before the player characters arrive. It's that kind of D&D fantasy, you know, where spellcasting is common and people know what certain spells are. So I think it's a bit gonzo in that sense. On the other hand, it's got plenty of sad things to write on index cards, like, as you mentioned, confused goblins suffering PTSD for things they don't really understand. There's a quite brutal bit of backstory with the Hill Temple, where basically all the monks got killed by possibly the wizard again because of something his brother had done. And it's got the sort of classic OSR weirdness in it as well. Like, one of the prisoners, if you get captured by the goblins, which is, I would say, the best way to get your player characters into the burrow. Obviously, there's a French soldier there whose, I think, main purpose is to help you learn French. And there's also a snake with the head of a man called Glykon, which is a reference to a Roman-era sort of mystery cult god who was that shape and was probably a hand puppet. So, yeah, like it's got a mixture of things going on, part of which is definitely absurdity. Not really helped by one of my player characters just having a shtick whereby he constantly tried to make friends with everyone he met. Which, by the way, is a great, if you're going to do a one-note character, turned out to be pretty good. Yeah, I think if you want dead serious gaming, you are going to want to do something a little bit different with this. Maybe take the dynamics at work and use that as a model, but I think you are not going to be able to drop this into your gritty and serious
grimdark fantasy campaign. Yeah. Second question, kind of related, and maybe not even an important question, but I'm still curious about it. Was your sense that this adventure is thematically consistent? I mean, it feels a bit like a hodgepodge to me as far as the themes that it plays with, even like the way things are named. Like Fairmead sounds like so, like very Western or something. I don't know. Like some of the elements just don't seem like they match. But then I'm thinking, well, it's a sort of gold rush setting, so maybe we have lots of different cultures influencing it or whatever. But I don't know. It felt a little inconsistent, a little hodgepodgey. What did you think about that?
It didn't feel like it when playing it and running it. But of course, that's hard to say because when you play a sandbox scenario, you only intersect with certain elements.
Right.
And the consistent theme is your character. So you tend to, the things you interact with start to form their own pattern. I think I can certainly see what you mean by hodgepodge. I mean, I feel like I can see the way in which it was conceived, which is time traveling. French weapon-armed goblins is kind of the first idea, probably. And then maybe it was married with a pre-existing idea of this fungus swamp that then fuels an entire island that everyone wants to fight over. And yeah, I sort of feel like it's an agglomeration around that of various ideas. But yeah, that's the thing. I think real life is pretty much a hodgepodge if you just cut across it in a straight line. So you have to rely on your characters wanting certain things, and that being then the elements that they choose to engage with. But there are certainly bits I was about to say aren't really explained or seem thrown in, but they're also pretty good in that sense. You know, like there's zombies wandering around the countryside. Who made them? I don't know, but you could go and find out, that kind of thing.
Right,
so, yeah, it's... I feel like saying it's just thrown together is doing a bit of a disservice to...
Yeah, I don't think it's bad. I think it's just... as we've explored on the show many, many times, I particularly enjoy like thematic connection, right? Like it's just something I like in games as a general matter. And so as just a reader of this adventure, I was trying to find the thematic through line and I was having a hard time with it. But I don't think it's important though. I mean, you're right. Like because it's a sandbox, we're not going to get the full sweep of it anyway, like through any particular playthrough. And yeah, the players, I guess, are the anchor. They're the consistent part. So yeah. Anyway, it's just something I noticed.
Yeah, no, I mean that said, there are a couple of recurring elements. There's a motif of revenge which happens, which is that more spoiler alert time, folks. So there's the not really dead mayor Aljeba who's gone up to the hill temple to nurse his wounds, and he's planning to come back and sweep in and basically kick over some tables and fire the mercenary leader who he thinks has betrayed him, I think. But in fact, the leader of the goblins is that guy's father who, was betrayed by his sons, turned into a weird-looking goblin, and is now plotting revenge against the town.
Right, yeah.
So and there's sort of an implication that the dragon I think that's what I read, because I was already primed to see revenge. I was sort of thinking maybe the goblins, drove him out of his haunt somewhere.
Did something to the dragon,
Yeah, so I think that's a theme. But yeah, it's not like it doesn't permeate absolutely everything in the module.
Yeah, I wouldn't say so. Okay, great. Let's go to the chain lightning round. Tom.
All right, so one of those threaded side quests. At one point, you can find the grave of the missing shopkeeper, Tonio, in a random encounter. Or rather, you can find his name on a tombstone, but there is no body interred nearby. And with everything that's going on, that could mean any number of things.
We have a rumor that says one day the cockroach people will come back and enclave all. This is almost certainly a typo. I think that's supposed to be enslave all, but I do like the idea of the cockroach people coming back and sort of enclaving everyone, separating them into distinct groups.
Also a rumour from the Fairmead table. Boiled tamarind meat is delicious. Brackets, false.
There is a farmlands encounter where the player characters might be asked to judge a giant cabbage competition.
I like Vasilia the Priestess's salve recipe for the Mykolol. It's an actual 5-step recipe for using the fungus and various ingredients, ending with store in a cool, dry place.
And finally, we have mentioned that the goblins ate the brains of these World War I soldiers that came through the time portal, and that gave the goblins their sort of memories and mental abilities. We learn at one point that the wizard has used their death fog wand on the goblins, and this death fog sort of triggered the goblins and caused them to run away because they're thinking about trench warfare during World War I, right? And if you know anything about World War I, this is a very sly, very twisted gallows humor kind of detail. Let's go to the Expert Delve. It's the Expert Delve. So, Tom, what are we talking about?
We are talking about the gold rush as a central thing to use in your scenarios. So when I was running Sacrebleu, I was sort of trying to work out why is this going okay? The conclusion I came to is that there is this central element in Sacrebleu, the Mykolol fungus. It's the reason everyone, or at least all the humans, everyone's on the island to get this. It's a highly valuable medical ingredient. It's the reason the town of Fairmead was originally founded. It's why people travel up the old road where you can get ambushed by goblins to go to Rich Man's Swamp. It's even why the goblins are raiding the humans, because they are unwittingly working for a transformed human who was betrayed by his sons to gain control of the island in order to gain control of the Mykolol resources. And it's very probably why your player characters came to the island in the first place. It's a resource that's difficult to acquire. You have to go to a certain place. You have to use special tools to harvest it. And it's expensive enough to make that worth doing. So when I thought about this, I realized that everyone on the island, all the different factions, the NPCs, have in some way a relationship to this resource. And it's basically like a gold rush, your pick of Australian Klondike, California. And it creates an interesting dynamic in a place. It's a resource that has a kind of inexorable gravity to it. Even people who aren't involved in the trade for the gold or whatever, will have their livelihoods and their lives affected by it, because, if they run a hotel, the people who are staying in the hotel are here because they're doing business related to it. And so they'll have feelings about it as well. And this kind of setting, it just creates all kinds of, it just has huge potential for games, and not just in a sort of playing prospectors or fungus gatherers way, I think. I mean, what's your initial reaction to this proposal anyway, Jason?
I think it's an interesting idea. I did not think about this setting as a gold rush setting until you started making your notes. But as I got thinking about it, I began to realize that we've played, or we've covered, and I've played in other adventures that have this as a central concept, right? Like whatever the gold is in the setting, people are kind of there to get it. I think that as far as this discussion goes, what I think is going to be really helpful is if we talk about how to bring forward the sort of fundamental character of a community that is based on a sort of gold rush impetus, right? And importantly, I also think it would be very wise of us to talk about Western colonial ideas of that tend to fuel fantasy, right? And or at least Western fantasy, and kind of how you can use a gold rush setting to at least acknowledge or explore some of the more problematic things behind it, right? I don't know if I'm personally super well equipped to do that, because I haven't really studied these critiques very much, but I know that they're out there. And so my initial thinking is, if you're going to build a setting, and you want to have a sort of gold rush be kind of like a central part of your setting or part of your adventure, what are some things that can help to, like, what are the sort of key characteristics of a community involved in a gold rush? So
yeah, that's a good question. I think a gold rush is distinct from like any kind of particularly prosperous town, is that it's normally a new settlement or a new community, actually, because they're not always, although we're thinking of things like boom towns, they're often, gold rushes can be more dispersed than that, and they're sort of like the Klondike gold rush, I think, was not like focused on one like city that everyone radiated out from. You sort of travelled and there were camps and so on. But it does create a strange new community where, actually, you mentioned the idea of a melting pot earlier, talking about Fairmead. I think that's one thing that happens. People come from a long way away to be in this one place, and so they have encounters and quite often frictions that they otherwise, that otherwise would never have arisen.
I think that's probably one of the most interesting things about such a setting, right? If you look at the full sweep of fantasy settings, for games throughout the ages, you often get settings that are intentionally strange. Like, the authors have very intentionally like put together like a mishmash of people that don't seem like they should belong, right? Like, but you have all various species and various cultures and various clans and whatnot all in this one place, and frequently it's not super obvious why that is the case. They're just there, right? But a gold rush is a great reason to have a community like that, right?
Yeah, that's right. And it's because it's new as well, I think it gives you that great thing of not really having to explore the city or the town in the same way that you often do, where it's a bit annoying. Everyone else knows their way around this town, but you don't. But in a boom town, everyone's new, so that's fine. Like, and they're literally building new houses and stuff every day. But that is the other thing, is I think all this newness, constantly meeting different people, the reason that you're there gives an interesting tension and drama. There's this sort of idea, fortunes can be made and lost very quickly. So everyone you're meeting could be your best friend potentially, or a terrible rival. And equally, a gold rush is based on a single resource. It's not like you've moved here and you're all working in different industries and everything's fine. It's all, if it's a literal gold rush, this town, this community is going to last until the gold dries up. Does gold dry up? I'm not sure if that's technically correct. Yeah. But yeah, you want to come in, make a fortune, and get out before it turns into a ghost town. And that really creates massive amounts of stress. Actually, that's true of any kind of monoculture. Like modern-day Macau has a big problem in that it's entirely focused on everyone works in casinos, and if that ever goes away, they're in serious trouble. So I think that's really interesting. It would be something you'd want to kind of keep bringing up, this sort of fear that, what if something goes wrong with the fungus in Rich Man's Swamp? What are we going to do? And that would really be a way to start tightening the screws on everyone.
And helpfully, that kind of stress and fear leads to violence.
Yeah. Right? I did some Googling. Did you know that in the 1980s, near the Sacrebleu gold mine in Brazil, there were 60 to 80 unsolved murders every month, which is insane. Wow. Even in a big city, that would be a lot. That is something that could easily happen. And as you can see in Fairmead in Erewhon, that's where you get sort of factional politics starting to happen. You've got the mercenaries as essentially a street gang. You could easily see some of the wealthier citizens starting to kind of buy up bodyguards and so on, and creating a kind of fistful of dollars situation where the town becomes, well, little enclaves, maybe we could call them, and starts to get sort of violent like that. Or it could just be, it's an incredibly lawless anarchic place. So you'd have to choose, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so something we should probably talk about is we keep saying gold rush, right? Gold. But of course, we're not talking about just gold, right? There are lots of different types of, quote, gold for your gold rush, right? And I think that's something we should make.
Yeah. So I think to create this kind of situation, it could be, well, the basic one is literally people going and digging gold out of the ground. The golden age of piracy in the Caribbean was also a kind of gold rush, in that having treasure ships coming back from the New World to Spain created an environment in which it became practical to be piratical, at least for a short time, and that's why that suddenly happened.
Practical to be piratical might be my new favorite phrase. I want that on a t-shirt.
Thank you very much. And But yeah, so but any luxury would do it, because of course that's, if you're digging it out of the ground for free, then your markup is great. But also it could be a resource that's precious only to a certain group. I think a classic fantasy one is magic ingredients for wizard spells, or in this case, fungus for alchemists, right? So
Pellerskite crystals, right?
And so ideally it's going to be something that anybody could get, but it has to be difficult. So you've got to be a little bit desperate to go and do it. And then the other thing for it to be a rush is it has to be something that's, quote marks on, undiscovered, which could mean it's in a remote location. And that's one reason gold rushes are great for survival stories, because if it's hard to get to, that explains why it's not already been got. Not in a remote location, but the people that live there didn't particularly value it before now. And that's when you start to get, colonization, basically. Or rather, that's not really true. That's the story that colonizers tell about the natives.
Yeah.
Like, those guys weren't even doing anything with this stuff. Yeah, they weren't using it.
They weren't going to use it. Good thing we got here. Yeah.
Yeah. They'd have just wasted it by, using it responsibly. And then kind of your third option, I think, is that a recent invention might make something valuable. So like someone invents a new technology that needs this thing for a fuel, or, a wizard creates a spell that requires, the talon of a giant eagle that wasn't required by any other spell before. And like an example we have today is uranium, quite valuable. Before the 19th century, it was just used for colouring glass. So, suddenly it's like flipping a switch and something takes on new properties.
Well, like thinking back to the corruption of the Pellerskite crystals, they originally used them just as like light sources, right, for their homes. Oh, yeah, and someone figured out you could use them to like power magic or whatever, right? So before we leave this topic, this has been a nice kind of overview of like what makes a gold rush setting enjoyable and fun. I think before we leave, though, we should I want to throw in a note that like one of the ways to really capture the full scope and texture and dimension of what could be happening in a setting like this is to be mindful of, does the setting have any native people who, like we alluded to, were not using the gold resource or using the resource, and how are they affected by the sudden influx of these people? I don't think you have to necessarily make that the focus of your adventure. I mean, that's going to be beyond the scope of like what most people sit down to do in a fantasy adventure game. But I do think that like you should at least endeavor to acknowledge the idea that there are probably native people there who, for whatever reason, are being pushed off their land, or who are maybe being taken advantage of in terms of like their labor and that kind of thing. I'm thinking of, in America, our big gold rush, of course, was on the West Coast and that whole part of the country, and like people kind of coming in like en masse to try to find gold. And, there were lots of conflicts with native peoples, right? And a lot of those native peoples were displaced. And so there's just a long, like, bloody, violent history there. And if you have the capacity to at least acknowledge some of those elements of the setting, I think it's better for it.
Yeah, I agree.
Anything else you want to say about the Gold Rush?
No, not really. Although I'd invite you, dear listener, to, if you have other examples of scenarios like this, to maybe let us know about it, because I think I'd like to see more of this plot device in action. I think it's quite promising.
Fantastic. Let's go to Companion Adventures. It's the Companion Adventures. I'm going to start with a TV show called Deadwood that ran from, I want to say like 2003 to 2006, somewhere around there on HBO. Deadwood is one of my absolute favorite TV shows of all time. Probably some of the best writing I've ever seen on anything. It's a great show in its own right, but helpfully, Deadwood is about a camp town, and it is about a camp town where there are people, I think it's silver that they're mining in Deadwood, if I'm not mistaken.
I think you're right, yeah.
I love it as a touchstone for like the sort of lawlessness of these like quite sudden boom towns, right? Deadwood, this camp town, it's very lawless. It has there are factions that rise up. The violence, like Tom alluded to, is quite pronounced in the setting. Like lots of people end up missing or gone, and no one really questions it.
Eaten by pigs.
Eaten by pigs, yeah. Precisely. And there's one episode early on in the series, I want to say it's around episode like 2 or 3 or 4, where we actually get to see kind of the brutality of the mining operation, right? Like a bunch of like miners are there, with the person who's employing them or the company that's employing them, and like just the sort of paranoia that the mining company like treated the workers with, and the kind of like basic brutality that they inflicted on the workers in the mine, and this sort of like just it's almost kind of like a horror kind of like thing, right? Like it's kind of scary in the way that like you see these humans treating other humans, right? And so if you really want like I just think it's a great series, but in particular when we're talking about like a gold rush setting, I think that Deadwood is a really good one.
All right, and I've got a film to recommend, which is a much more straight-ahead action adventure, but also kind of similar in setting to Deadwood, and actually also features a mining company mistreating people, now that I think about it at the beginning. And that is The Treasure of the Sierra Madre from 1948, starring Humphrey Bogart. And this is a great example. I think you could just run the plot of The Treasure of Sierra Madre in Erewhon, in Sacrebleu, with fungus, and it would work pretty well. It's all about, well, just the paranoia that you've mentioned in Deadwood, and this group of 3 men who find they've got a lead on what's the word I'm after here? A vein of gold that no one else knows about. And they go up into the mountains to find it, and then they're worried about people coming and finding their camp. Which some local bandits eventually do, and there's a shootout. This is the film from which the infamous "We don't need no stinking badges" line comes from. And good film. I think it was based on a novel that was quite grim, but this is the sort of Hollywood adventure version, and it's got some great scenes of Humphrey Bogart becoming avaricious and convinced that everyone's out to steal his share of the gold.
I'm going to recommend I believe it's a 6-part series, a podcast series by Dan Carlin. So Dan Carlin produces a couple of podcast series, but one of them is Hardcore History, which is probably his real popular one. And Hardcore History, each episode is like a 3 to 4 hour long discourse on a particular era of history. Dan Carlin is not a historian himself, as he likes to frequently say on the show, but he does the work, though. He does the work of like reading lots of historians and collecting different points of view and just kind of presenting them in a very listenable format. The series that I'm particularly interested in here is Blueprint for Armageddon, which was a 6-part series about World War I. And in total, it's something like 20 hours of listening or something, right? It's a very like long series, but it's so good. He covers so many different aspects of the Great War, both leading up to it and in the middle of it. And I was just reminded of it, like when I was reading about these goblins, right? And and so, yeah, if you want to kind of explore the history of World War I that kind of underpins the kind of basic joke of the goblins, I guess, this is a great way of doing it. It's something you can digest over the course of a few weeks. You can listen to it in your car. It's a great listen.
All right, nice. And finally, I've got a music recommendation, which is designed to evoke that Brazilian landscape for you. It's an album called Urubu by Antonio Carlos Jobim. He was most famous for his bossa nova music, of course, but this one is a later album where there's a bit of bossa in there, but a lot of different genres, and it's sort of thematically based on the wildlife of Brazil. The Amazon rainforest in Urubu is a kind of is it a buzzard or vulture, and especially the opening track Obotu is worth listening to. It starts with the sound of a berimbau traditional instrument, and the song is about the various animals you'll find in the jungle. And so some nice easy listening for you to hike through the ways and mountain valleys of Erewhon too.
Fantastic. Before we do our conclusion notes here, listeners, I want to take a moment to let you know that our longtime, or our editor and co-creator of Fear of a Black Dragon, Paul Edson, passed away several weeks ago. And obviously, Tom and I are really upset about that. It was a very hard time, and we worked really closely with Paul on the show, and a lot of the reason for the show's success is the production efforts that Paul put into it. And so I just want to take a moment to just honor Paul and his memory, and say that we extend our condolences to his family, and you may have noticed, listeners, that we had kind of like a period of like where there weren't any releases, and that's because we were trying to kind of right the ship a little bit after Paul's passing. And so, but we're good to go now. We have a brand new co-producer in Luke Wade. Yeah, just, keep Paul in your thoughts. If you've enjoyed this show, just understand that Paul was a major reason for its success and its quality. And so with that, let's say that Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. We can be found on our website, gauntlet-rpg.com. We have a new forums on the Gauntlet. It's forums.gauntlet-rpg.com. Please come to the forums and get involved in our discussions, not just about Fear of a Black Dragon, but lots of discussions about role-playing games are going on over there. It's a really great space. We have a Twitter. It's at GauntletRPG, and we are on Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thanks so much.
Jason, thank you. And thanks to Luke Wade for editing.
And listeners, that's our show. Take care.